Have you ever felt trapped by your own thoughts, like your mind is silently sabotaging your happiness? The shocking truth is this: most people fall into invisible psychological traps every day, and few ever recognize them. These traps aren't obvious. They're subtle, silent, and often disguised as normal thought patterns, habits, or even virtues. But here's the part nobody talks about. Once you fall into one, it quietly reshapes your perception of reality, alters your decisions, and quietly drains your energy. Wait until you hear this. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, warned that many of these traps originate from the unconscious mind. They're not random. They are patterns deeply rooted in human nature, shadow tendencies, and our unresolved inner conflicts. And the frightening part? They often appear as comfort, security, or self-protection. Luring you deeper into their web, consider the first trap, the trap of identification. Most people define themselves entirely through external roles: the hardworking professional, the devoted parent, the caring partner. On the surface, this seems normal, even virtuous. But here's the part nobody talks about. When your identity is rigidly tied to roles, any threat to those roles triggers extreme fear, anxiety, or defensiveness. The mind becomes a prison because self-worth is no longer internal. It's conditional. For example, imagine Sarah, who always saw herself as the dependable colleague. When a project failed due to circumstances beyond her control, she internalized the failure, believing it reflected her entire worth. She became anxious, isolated, and hypervigilant. This trap had quietly consumed her sense of self, leaving her vulnerable to deeper psychological manipulation. Wait until you hear this. The second trap is the trap of projection. Jung emphasized that the human psyche unconsciously projects undesirable traits onto others. When you constantly criticize or resent someone, it may reflect an internal aspect of yourself you refuse to acknowledge. But here's the part nobody talks about. Projection doesn't just distort perception, it controls behavior, sabotages relationships, and keeps you from facing personal growth. Consider a story. Michael consistently complained about his friend's arrogance. Over time, he noticed patterns. He reacted with intense irritation whenever his friend spoke up. Upon reflection, he realized he projected his own insecurity and need for validation onto his friend. Recognizing projection was painful but liberating, allowing him to reclaim emotional control. Wait until you hear this. The third trap is the trap of emotional dependency. Many people seek constant validation, approval, or attention. On the surface, this may look like connection or affection, but Jung warned that it enslaves the psyche. Emotional dependency makes you reactive, easily manipulated, and perpetually anxious. The mind becomes addicted to external reassurance rather than self-validation. Consider Lisa, who constantly needed friends and colleagues to confirm her decisions. When a single comment didn't align with her expectations, she spiraled into self-doubt and over-analysis. This trap slowly eroded her confidence, leaving her mentally exhausted. Only by cultivating self-reflection, personal boundaries, and internal validation did she regain autonomy. But here's the part nobody talks about. The fourth trap is the trap of unconscious repetition. Jung called this the compulsion to repeat, the human tendency to reenact unresolved patterns, often choosing situations, relationships, or conflicts that echo past traumas. This trap silently destroys peace, because the mind keeps reliving the same unhealed wounds. Consider a metaphor. Imagine walking on a circular path in a dense fog. Every step feels different, but eventually you end up in the same place. That's unconscious repetition. You believe progress is happening, but patterns keep bringing you back to familiar emotional pain. Recognizing this requires awareness, shadow work, and deliberate choice. Wait until you hear this. The fifth trap is the trap of illusionary control. Many believe they can control outcomes, other people, or circumstances. But Jung warned that the mind's need for control often backfires. The illusion of control generates anxiety, rigidity, and fear of uncertainty. The more you try to micromanage, the more the psyche rebels, creating chaos that feeds the trap. Consider James, a manager obsessed with perfection. He micromanaged every team project, believing success depended solely on his oversight. But projects failed due to unpredictable factors and his anxiety escalated. The illusion of control had secretly consumed him, eroding trust, creativity, and resilience. But here's the part nobody talks about. The sixth trap is the trap of moral absolutism. Many individuals rigidly define right and wrong, good and bad, without acknowledging nuance or the complexity of human behavior. Jung emphasized that this rigidity creates inner conflict, judgment, and resistance to change. It's a trap because it limits perception, fosters resentment, and makes the psyche brittle. Consider a story. Emma believed anyone who made mistakes was bad. She became unforgiving, critical, and isolated herself emotionally. Over time, this rigid moral lens distorted her reality, creating resentment and bitterness that silently undermined mental health. Only by embracing nuance, self-compassion, and tolerance could she dismantle this trap. Wait until you hear this. The seventh and perhaps most dangerous trap is the trap of unacknowledged shadow. Jung insisted that everyone carries a shadow, the repressed, denied, or unloved parts of the self. Ignoring this aspect leads to projection, self-sabotage, and repetition of harmful patterns. But here's the part nobody talks about. The shadow doesn't stay hidden forever. If unexamined, it erupts unconsciously, often in ways that damage relationships, career, or health. Consider a metaphor. Think of the shadow as a pressure cooker. Deny its presence and the heat builds. Eventually it explodes unpredictably, leaving destruction in its wake. Facing the shadow, through reflection, therapy, or journaling, releases the pressure safely and transforms it into creative and emotional energy. Wait until you hear this. These 7 traps aren't just theoretical concepts. They are living forces that quietly shape thoughts, emotions, and actions. The mind is like a complex ecosystem. Unacknowledged patterns spread like invasive species, draining energy, distorting perception, and limiting potential. But recognition is the first step to liberation. But here's the part nobody talks about. The traps interact. Identification fuels projection. Emotional dependency amplifies repetition. Illusionary control intensifies moral rigidity. Shadow avoidance compounds all others. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle of psychological erosion that often goes unnoticed until damage is severe. Consider a story. Alex repeatedly entered relationships with controlling partners, projecting his own insecurities while attempting to control outcomes. He justified behavior through rigid moral standards and relied on external validation for worth. Over time, he realized the 7 traps had operated in unison, silently dismantling his confidence, autonomy, and emotional stability. Awareness, he discovered, was the first true act of resistance. Wait until you hear this. Understanding these traps is not meant to induce fear, guilt, or paralysis. It's a guide to self-mastery. By observing patterns, cultivating awareness, and engaging in reflective practices, you can prevent the traps from dominating your psyche. Jung emphasized that recognition, not repression, is the key to transformation. But here's the part nobody talks about. True liberation comes from integration. Shadow work, reflection, emotional self-regulation, and conscious choice transform traps into insights. The mind that once enslaved itself becomes a source of power, creativity, and clarity. Awareness turns traps into teachers rather than tormentors. So let me ask you, are you noticing the subtle ways your mind may be sabotaging you? Which of these traps silently controls your decisions, emotions, or relationships? Awareness is not passive. It's the first act of reclaiming freedom, clarity, and psychological sovereignty. In the next part, we'll explore practical techniques to dismantle these traps, including shadow work exercises, emotional regulation strategies, and methods to break unconscious repetition, empowering you to regain control over your mind and life. Have you ever caught yourself repeating the same mistakes, wondering why life keeps delivering the same painful lessons? The shocking truth is that your mind may be trapping you without your awareness. But here's the part nobody talks about. These traps aren't just external circumstances. They are patterns created by your own unconscious, and they shape your reality in ways you can't always see. Wait until you hear this. The first technique to dismantle these traps is shadow acknowledgement. Jung's concept of the shadow is often misunderstood. It's not evil or dangerous in itself. It's the repressed, ignored, or disowned parts of your psyche. By acknowledging your shadow, you prevent it from unconsciously controlling your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Confronting the shadow may feel uncomfortable, but discomfort is a sign of growth. Consider a story. Sophie repeatedly attracted friends who betrayed her trust. She was puzzled until she reflected and realized that she unconsciously mirrored traits she had disowned: secrecy, defensiveness, and avoidance, projecting them onto others. By acknowledging her shadow, she stopped repeating these patterns and began cultivating healthier relationships. But here's the part nobody talks about. Shadow acknowledgement isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing practice. Daily journaling, reflection, and honest self-assessment allow you to spot projections and defensive patterns early. The mind is a skilled trickster. Ignoring subtle signs gives the shadow free rein. Wait until you hear this. The second technique is boundary reinforcement. Emotional and psychological traps often exploit overexposure or blurred boundaries. Establishing and maintaining clear boundaries protects your energy, prevents manipulation, and reduces anxiety. Boundaries are not walls. They're guidelines for safe and respectful interaction. Consider a metaphor. Imagine your psyche as a garden. Boundaries function as fences. They keep invasive plants out while allowing sunlight and nutrients to reach the flowers. Without fences, the garden becomes overrun, chaotic, and unsustainable. Boundary reinforcement is a daily act of cultivating your inner space. But here's the part nobody talks about. Enforcing boundaries requires consistency. One lapse sends signals to our unconscious and others that limits are negotiable. Hyper-aware individuals know that boundaries are living structures. They must be checked, reinforced, and occasionally adjusted as circumstances change. Wait until you hear this. The third technique is pattern observation and documentation. Many psychological traps thrive because patterns are unconscious. By recording behaviors, emotional reactions, and recurring conflicts, you bring them into conscious awareness. Observation transforms repetition into actionable insight. Consider a story. Daniel noticed that whenever he faced criticism, he withdrew emotionally and became defensive. By documenting these reactions over several months, he realized the pattern originated from childhood experiences of judgment and fear of rejection. Awareness allowed him to respond consciously rather than react unconsciously. But here's the part nobody talks about. Pattern observation must be objective. Emotional journaling is valuable, but attaching judgment or guilt can reinforce the trap. Simply noting behavior, context, and emotional response allows the mind to process without self-sabotage. Wait until you hear this. The fourth technique is emotional self-regulation. Traps like projection, emotional dependency, and identification exploit reactivity. By cultivating calm, awareness, and measured responses, you reduce the shadow's power. Mindfulness, breathwork, and meditation are practical tools for developing this skill. Consider a metaphor. Picture a storm at sea. Emotional turbulence can drive a ship onto rocks if uncontrolled. Self-regulation functions as the rudder, allowing you to navigate safely through turbulent waters without being swept off course. But here's the part nobody talks about. Self-regulation is not suppression. It's awareness with deliberate response. Suppression buries the shadow temporarily. Regulation allows observation, integration, and strategic action. Wait until you hear this. The fifth technique is selective exposure. Not all influences, relationships, or environments serve your growth. Emotional traps are amplified by repeated exposure to toxic people, environments, or media. Strategic disengagement from these sources preserves energy, focus, and mental clarity. Consider a story. Rachel frequently interacted with colleagues who thrived on gossip. By limiting exposure and choosing engagements consciously, she reduced emotional drain and regained psychological balance. Selective exposure is not avoidance. It's smart management of resources and energy. But here's the part nobody talks about. Selective exposure must be deliberate, not reactive. Avoidance fueled by fear or resentment merely delays confrontation with patterns. Conscious choice ensures psychological empowerment. Wait until you hear this. The sixth technique is active reframing. Traps like moral absolutism or illusionary control distort perception, making situations seem rigid, threatening, or impossible. By consciously reframing narratives, you reclaim interpretation and mental freedom. Consider a story. Alex felt trapped by a failing project, believing it reflected personal incompetence. By reframing it as an opportunity for learning and skill development, stress decreased, clarity improved, and proactive solutions emerged. Reframing transforms entrapment into empowerment, but here's the part nobody talks about. Reframing requires emotional honesty. Ignoring pain or pretending everything is positive is not reframing. It's denial. Reframing acknowledges reality while shifting perception toward constructive insight. Wait until you hear this. The seventh technique is integration through creative expression. Jung emphasized the transformative power of engaging unconscious material through art, writing, or symbolic work. The traps are rooted in unconscious dynamics. Creative expression allows unconscious material to surface safely and consciously. Consider a metaphor. Think of the mind as a dark cave. Traps hide in shadows, unseen and dangerous. Creative expression is like a torch, illuminating hidden areas, revealing obstacles, and allowing safe navigation. Without light, the cave remains perilous and disorienting. But here's the part nobody talks about. Integration is not a passive process. It requires deliberate engagement, reflection, and iterative practice. Awareness alone is insufficient. Transformation demands consistent action, introspection, and honest confrontation with personal patterns. Wait until you hear this. Combining these 7 techniques forms a comprehensive system. Shadow acknowledgement, boundaries, pattern observation, emotional regulation, selective exposure, reframing, and creative integration work synergistically. Alone, each technique has value. Together, they dismantle the traps silently controlling your mind. But here's the part nobody talks about. Mastery of psychological traps doesn't guarantee a smooth life. The mind is dynamic and new patterns emerge. Continuous vigilance, reflection, and adaptation ensure long-term resilience, autonomy, and mental clarity. So let me ask you, are you ready to start observing your patterns, acknowledging your shadow, and reclaiming control over your mind? Awareness is the first act. Strategic engagement transforms observation into power. Have you ever watched someone seemingly free of worry, confident in their life, and wondered why you can't reach that same peace? The shocking truth is that many people are unconsciously caught in the very traps that silently dictate behavior, perception, and emotional responses. But here's the part nobody talks about. The difference between those who thrive and those who struggle isn't luck, it's awareness, strategy, and conscious integration. Wait until you hear this. Consider Emily, a professional in her early 30s, constantly overwhelmed by work, relationships, and her own inner voice. She experienced repeated emotional setbacks, always believing that other people or circumstances were the root of her struggle. In reality, she was entangled in multiple psychological traps: identification with perfectionism, projection of insecurity onto colleagues, and unconscious repetition of relational conflicts. But here's the part nobody talks about. Emily's first breakthrough came when she began shadow journaling. Every time she felt triggered, she recorded the emotions, thoughts, and situations in detail. Slowly, patterns emerged. She realized that her intense reactions were often mirrors of her own disowned traits: impatience, fear of failure, and subtle control tendencies. Recognizing these patterns allowed her to take ownership, transforming external blame into internal insight. Wait until you hear this. The next stage involved boundary cultivation. Emily learned to say no without guilt, limit exposure to draining people, and allocate time for mental restoration. This simple yet profound shift reduced emotional fatigue and gave her mind space to process. Boundaries acted as invisible shields, protecting energy that had previously been siphoned by people-pleasing behaviors and unconscious projections. Consider a story. Tom, a manager in a high-pressure firm, constantly felt frustrated with his team. Initially, he blamed them entirely for missed deadlines. Over time, he realized he projected his own fear of inadequacy onto them, reacting with impatience and micromanagement. By acknowledging this shadow projection, setting clear expectations and allowing autonomy, Tom regained control over his emotional responses and improved team dynamics simultaneously. But here's the part nobody talks about. Pattern observation is not passive. It requires disciplined attention. Watching your own behavior in real time without self-judgment exposes the subtle traps you've internalized. Emily noticed that whenever a colleague criticized her, she defaulted to over-explaining, defending herself, and doubting her worth. She learned to pause, reflect, and respond strategically rather than react emotionally. Wait until you hear this. Emotional regulation played a transformative role. Techniques such as breathwork, guided meditation, and somatic awareness helped Emily respond to triggers with calm rather than panic. The psychological traps rely on reactivity. Once she slowed down, the traps lost their grip. It was as though the invisible chains quietly controlling her mind were breaking, one deliberate pause at a time. But here's the part nobody talks about. Selective exposure reshapes reality. Emily began curating her environment consciously. She spent less time with draining individuals, avoided sensationalist media that amplified anxiety, and prioritized spaces that energized her. By reducing unnecessary emotional input, she strengthened her internal clarity, making the mind less susceptible to manipulative or negative patterns. Consider a metaphor. Imagine your mind as a vessel collecting water from streams around you. Some streams are pure, nourishing, and essential. Others are polluted, toxic, and draining. By selectively allowing which streams fill your vessel, you maintain clarity and resilience. Ignoring this principle floods the mind with unnecessary toxins, reinforcing psychological traps. Wait until you hear this. Reframing was another critical step. Instead of labeling mistakes or conflicts as failures, Emily began viewing them as lessons. Instead of seeing herself as a victim of circumstance, she considered each challenge as an opportunity for growth and insight. Reframing is more than positive thinking. It's an active reconstruction of meaning that neutralizes the psychological traps of moral absolutism and illusionary control. But here's the part nobody talks about. Creative integration amplifies insight. Emily started painting, composing music, and writing reflective essays. Engaging with unconscious material through creativity allowed her to visualize patterns, express repressed emotions, and integrate shadow aspects safely. Jung emphasized that the unconscious communicates symbolically. Ignoring these signals strengthens traps, while engaging them transforms latent energy into conscious power. Consider a story. Marcus, a software developer, experienced persistent anxiety and relational conflicts. Traditional therapy helped, but real transformation occurred when he began sculpting as a reflective exercise. Patterns of control, perfectionism, and projection emerged in his art. Small unconscious gestures became visible, concrete, and manageable. By observing, acknowledging, and interpreting these creative outputs, Marcus developed strategies to respond rather than react in daily life. Wait until you hear this. Integrating these techniques creates a dynamic feedback loop. Shadow acknowledgement informs boundaries. Observed patterns enhance emotional regulation. Creative expression strengthens awareness. Reframing reshapes perception. Each element reinforces the others, progressively dismantling psychological traps and restoring mental sovereignty. But here's the part nobody talks about. The mind can adapt in ways that appear unconscious but are highly strategic. Without awareness, traps remain hidden, yet the brain constantly seeks equilibrium. Once we intervene consciously, the mind begins to self-correct, creating resilience that becomes habitual. Emily and Marcus were no longer passive participants in their mental landscape. They became architects of perception, emotion, and behavior. Wait until you hear this. One subtle yet profound insight emerges from these case studies. Traps thrive in isolation. Individuals who lack reflection, social support, or accountability often remain entangled indefinitely. Sharing insights with trusted allies, mentors, or therapists reinforces awareness, validates experiences, and provides perspective that prevents self-deception. But here's the part nobody talks about. Resilience emerges not from avoiding triggers, but from navigating them with conscious awareness. The psychological traps aren't eradicated. They exist in the human mind. Mastery lies in recognizing triggers, observing patterns, and responding intentionally rather than reacting unconsciously. So let me ask you, are you ready to observe your own mind like a case study? To document patterns, cultivate boundaries, regulate emotion, reframe narratives, and engage creatively? Awareness alone is insufficient. Applied insight is the key to dismantling the traps silently shaping your reality. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to navigate life effortlessly while others feel perpetually stuck? The shocking truth is that success, clarity, and emotional stability aren't luck. They are the result of consciously dismantling the subtle psychological traps that silently dominate the mind. But here's the part nobody talks about. Even small daily practices, when applied consistently, can completely transform your internal landscape. Wait until you hear this. Let's begin with shadow journaling exercises. This isn't ordinary journaling, it's a structured approach to uncovering hidden aspects of your psyche. Start each day by noting your emotional reactions from the previous day. Ask yourself, what triggered me? What emotions surfaced? Did I react or respond consciously? Which aspects of myself might I be projecting onto others? Consider a metaphor. Imagine your mind as a hidden attic filled with forgotten objects. Shadow journaling is the flashlight that illuminates the corners, revealing clutter that silently trips you up. Once visible, you can organize, process, and either integrate or discard what no longer serves you. But here's the part nobody talks about. The goal is not perfection or moral judgment. The goal is awareness. Acknowledging your shadow doesn't make you flawed. It makes you conscious. Over time, this practice transforms triggers into tools for insight and growth. Wait until you hear this. Next, we focus on boundary reinforcement exercises. Boundaries are invisible fences, protecting your energy and mental clarity. Begin by identifying areas where you feel drained, manipulated, or overextended. Ask yourself, where do I say yes when I want to say no? Which situations repeatedly leave me depleted? Once identified, start with small, actionable steps. Politely decline requests that overstep limits. Reduce time with people who trigger projection or emotional dependency. Prioritize activities that replenish rather than drain. Consider a story. Maria was exhausted by a group of friends who constantly sought advice but never reciprocated support. By setting boundaries, declining certain interactions, and focusing on nourishing relationships, she reclaimed energy she didn't realize she'd lost to unconscious traps. But here's the part nobody talks about. Consistency is key. Boundaries must be reinforced daily, even when met with resistance or discomfort. The mind tests limits to see if they are enforceable. Stand firm and the traps lose power. Wait until you hear this. Pattern observation exercises are another cornerstone. Take 5 minutes daily to reflect on recurring emotional triggers, conflicts, or thoughts. Use a simple chart. Trigger gives reaction, gives shadow element, gives outcome. Over time, patterns emerge, revealing unconscious cycles. Consider a metaphor. Imagine a spider web of habits and reactions, invisible to the naked eye. Pattern observation shines a light, revealing the threads. Once seen, you can choose which threads to untangle, cut, or reinforce, but here's the part nobody talks about. Pattern observation without action is insufficient. Recognition must be paired with intentional response. If you see a repeated conflict but continue reacting unconsciously, the trap remains active. Awareness only becomes liberation when paired with deliberate intervention. Wait until you hear this. Emotional regulation exercises are essential. Begin with breath work. Inhale slowly for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 6. Notice the shift in mental clarity and emotional control. Incorporate mindfulness by observing sensations, thoughts, or urges without judgment. Consider a story. Ethan constantly spiraled into anxiety during work conflicts. By practicing daily breathwork and mindfulness, he created a space between stimulus and response. Triggers no longer dictated his reactions. He became a conscious observer of his own mind. But here's the part nobody talks about. Emotional regulation strengthens all other strategies. When the mind is calm, boundary enforcement becomes easier. Shadow acknowledgement is less threatening, and pattern observation is more accurate. The traps thrive on reactivity. Self-regulation undermines their foundation. Wait until you hear this. Selective exposure exercises involve auditing your environment. Identify people, media, and activities that consistently drain energy or reinforce fear, guilt, or resentment. Strategically limit exposure and intentionally seek nourishing sources of input. Consider a metaphor. Imagine your energy as a reservoir. Toxic inputs act like leaks, draining the reservoir faster than you can replenish. Selective exposure patches leaks, allowing energy to accumulate, fueling clarity, creativity, and resilience. But here's the part nobody talks about. Selective exposure requires honesty. Some triggers may feel normal or inevitable, but they may still fuel unconscious traps. Observing discomfort is not weakness. It's data. The goal is conscious choice, not avoidance. Wait until you hear this. Reframing exercises are subtle yet powerful. When faced with conflict, failure, or criticism, ask, what can I learn? How might this situation offer insight or growth? How can I respond with awareness rather than reaction? Consider a story. Layla felt devastated after a professional setback. By consciously reframing the experience as feedback rather than judgment, she transformed anxiety into motivation, clarity, and actionable plans. Reframing dismantles the traps of moral absolutism and illusionary control, allowing freedom in perception and response. But here's the part nobody talks about. Reframing is not optimism. It's conscious reinterpretation. You acknowledge the difficulty without being dominated by it. You reclaim control over narrative and meaning. Wait until you hear this. Finally, creative integration exercises involve engaging with unconscious material through art, writing, or symbolic work. Daily creative expression helps surface shadow content safely, process emotions, and consolidate insights from journaling, boundaries, and framing. Consider a story. James struggled with anger and relational tension. By painting abstract emotions, he externalized internal patterns, visually representing triggers, shadows, and cycles. Observing his own creations allowed him to recognize destructive habits, projective tendencies, and habitual responses all before they influenced real-world interactions. But here's the part nobody talks about. Integration through creativity isn't optional. Ignoring unconscious material allows traps to operate unchecked. By engaging symbolically, you not only understand but transform latent patterns into conscious, manageable forces. Wait until you hear this. Applying these exercises consistently creates a dynamic cycle. Awareness informs boundaries. Observation informs regulation, and creative integration solidifies insight. Over time, psychological traps lose control. Mental clarity strengthens and emotional resilience deepens. But here's the part nobody talks about. Transformation isn't linear. Some days will feel like progress, others like relapse. This is normal. The traps are adaptive, and the mind is learning new ways to restore equilibrium. Patience, consistency, and reflection are essential. So let me ask you, are you ready to commit to daily practices that dismantle the 7 psychological traps? Are you ready to reclaim clarity, autonomy, and control over your mind? Awareness is just the beginning. Action is where freedom begins. Have you ever wondered why, even after understanding your triggers, some patterns still repeat? The shocking truth is that awareness alone isn't enough. The mind's unconscious machinery runs silently in the background, constantly seeking equilibrium. But here's the part nobody talks about. Unless you integrate conscious strategies into daily life, these psychological traps quietly regain control. Wait until you hear this. Advanced integration begins with habitual reflection. Set aside at least 10 minutes daily to review your reactions, thoughts, and interactions. Ask yourself, did I respond consciously or react unconsciously? Where did my shadow appear? Did I enforce boundaries effectively? Over time, these micro-reflections strengthen neural pathways for self-awareness, making intentional behavior increasingly automatic. Consider a story. Claire, a high-performing executive, had mastered basic shadow acknowledgement and boundaries. Yet she often found herself frustrated with colleagues or overwhelmed by deadlines. Through daily reflection, she noticed recurring patterns, impatience, subtle perfectionism, and projection onto others. Awareness alone hadn't stopped the cycles. Deliberate reflection allowed her to intervene before triggers escalated into stress, but here's the part nobody talks about. Reflection is most effective when paired with pattern mapping. Take recurring emotional responses and plot them over time: triggers, reactions, shadow elements, and outcomes. Visualizing patterns makes invisible connections visible and helps predict potential pitfalls before they dominate behavior. Wait until you hear this. Another key technique is emotional rehearsal. Before entering potentially triggering situations, practice emotional regulation in advance. Visualize yourself responding calmly, assertively, and intentionally. This primes the nervous system, reducing reactive tendencies and enhancing conscious choice in real-life scenarios. Consider a metaphor. Imagine a chess player anticipating moves several turns ahead. Emotional rehearsal is like predicting the opponent's strategies, allowing you to respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. Over time, preparation becomes instinctive, transforming reactivity into deliberate action. But here's the part nobody talks about. Emotional rehearsal isn't pretending or suppressing feelings. It's rehearsal of response, not denial of experience. Acknowledge potential triggers while training the mind to respond strategically. Wait until you hear this. Environmental restructuring is another advanced strategy. Surround yourself with stimuli that reinforce awareness, calm, and growth. This includes people, spaces, media, and daily routines. Replace environments that perpetuate stress, anxiety, or projection with spaces that nourish clarity and resilience. Consider a story. Liam, an artist, found that certain social circles amplified his self-doubt and creative block. By limiting exposure to these influences and intentionally engaging with supportive peers and inspiring environments, he reclaimed focus, energy, and creativity. Psychological traps thrive in chaotic or draining environments. Restructuring creates a buffer that supports conscious growth, but here's the part nobody talks about. Environmental restructuring requires honesty and sometimes difficult choices. You may need to reduce contact with loved ones who unknowingly trigger patterns, or remove yourself from professional or social settings that perpetuate anxiety. Liberation often requires temporary discomfort for long-term gain. Wait until you hear this. Another powerful tool is symbolic processing. Jung emphasized that the unconscious communicates through symbols, dreams, and metaphors. Engaging with dreams, art, or symbolic writing reveals hidden dynamics that conscious thought alone cannot access. Recognizing and interpreting these symbols accelerates shadow integration and exposes subtle traps before they manifest externally. Consider a story. Nadia experienced recurring dreams of being trapped in a maze, chased by faceless figures. Initially, she ignored them as mere fantasy. By journaling, drawing, and analyzing the symbolism, she realized the maze represented career-induced stress and faceless figures were projections of internalized fear of judgment. Understanding the symbols allowed her to navigate challenges consciously rather than unconsciously reacting. But here's the part nobody talks about. Symbolic processing isn't literal interpretation. It's a dialogue with the unconscious. The mind speaks metaphorically. Ignoring these messages allows traps to operate undetected. Engaging with them transforms latent energy into actionable insight. Wait until you hear this. Integration through mentorship or accountability accelerates transformation. Sharing insights with trusted guides or mentors provides external perspective, validates experiences, and reduces blind spots. Psychological traps often persist because the mind normalizes them. Outside feedback illuminates unseen patterns. Consider a metaphor. Imagine navigating a dark forest alone. Even with a flashlight, visibility is limited. A guide with a broader view helps you spot hidden obstacles, providing clarity, direction, and reassurance. Similarly, mentors help identify subtle psychological traps and reinforce conscious strategies. But here's the part nobody talks about. Accountability must be collaborative, not judgmental. The goal is insight and growth, not criticism. Choosing mentors who embody clarity and resilience ensures that guidance is constructive rather than draining or manipulative. Wait until you hear this. Finally, ritualized integration consolidates all techniques into daily life. This may include morning reflection, shadow journaling, boundary checks, mindfulness practice, creative expression, and evening review. Ritualization transforms conscious effort into habitual resilience, making psychological traps increasingly difficult to activate. Consider a story. Alex structured his mornings around meditation, journaling, and intention setting. Even during stressful workdays, he noticed a reduction in reactive tendencies and a heightened ability to navigate emotional triggers. Over months, these rituals became internalized patterns, empowering him to act rather than react automatically. But here's the part nobody talks about. Rituals aren't rigid or formulaic. They are flexible frameworks that support conscious awareness. The goal is integration, not perfection. Missing a day doesn't reverse progress, but consistency compounds results exponentially over time. Wait until you hear this. Applying these advanced techniques creates a self-reinforcing system. Shadow acknowledgement informs boundaries, emotional rehearsal enhances regulation, symbolic processing reveals unconscious traps, and daily rituals consolidate insights. Each element strengthens the others, progressively dismantling the subtle patterns that quietly control thought, behavior, and emotion. But here's the part nobody talks about. Mastery is not about eliminating psychological traps entirely. The mind is dynamic and adaptive. Mastery is the ability to detect, respond, and navigate traps as they arise, maintaining freedom, clarity, and autonomy. So let me ask you, are you ready to transform your daily routines into instruments of conscious control? To reclaim mental clarity, emotional resilience, and behavioral freedom? Awareness is the beginning. Integration is where transformation truly happens. Have you ever wondered what it really looks like when someone breaks free from the invisible chains of psychological traps? The shocking truth is that transformation is not instantaneous. It is a layered, sometimes uncomfortable process that reveals hidden strength, clarity, and resilience. But here's the part nobody talks about. The journey from unconscious repetition to conscious mastery reshapes the mind, emotions, and relationships in ways you might never expect. Wait until you hear this. Take the example of Hannah, a woman in her late 20s who struggled with emotional reactivity, people-pleasing, and relentless self-doubt. She had completed shadow work exercises and daily reflection for several months, but still found herself in familiar cycles of frustration and exhaustion. What changed her trajectory wasn't more theory. It was applied integration. Hannah began documenting patterns in real time. Every emotional reaction, trigger, and impulse was recorded alongside her responses and perceived shadow elements. This process highlighted subtle projections she had never noticed: impatience disguised as concern, resentment disguised as obligation, and fear disguised as over-preparation. By confronting these elements consciously, Hannah disrupted the unconscious scripts that had dominated her interactions for years. But here's the part nobody talks about. Transformation often begins with discomfort. Hannah experienced anxiety and guilt when she enforced boundaries, noticing immediate resistance from colleagues and family members accustomed to her compliance. Yet, through consistent practice, these reactions shifted. Boundaries became a source of strength, not isolation. Psychological traps thrive on habitual compliance. Asserting conscious limits breaks their hold. Wait until you hear this. Emotional regulation became central to Hannah's progress. She practiced breathwork, mindfulness, and somatic awareness before, during, and after triggering events. The difference was profound. Instead of reacting automatically, she observed the emotional surge, identified the unconscious pattern, and chose a deliberate response. Over time, emotional volatility decreased, and her relationships improved dramatically. Consider a metaphor. Imagine a stormy river representing reactive emotion. Hannah's techniques built a dam of awareness, allowing controlled release and measured flow rather than chaos. Without this dam, every trigger sent her downstream, powerless and exhausted. But here's the part nobody talks about. Real-life application demands patience. The mind resists sudden shifts. Psychological traps are adaptive and persistent. Progress is incremental. Hannah's victories were small but cumulative, each reinforcing her autonomy and clarity. Wait until you hear this. Selective exposure accelerated transformation. Hannah audited her environment, eliminating relationships and interactions that reinforced projection, guilt, or energy depletion. She cultivated connections that supported reflection, emotional safety, and personal growth. By choosing influences consciously, she reduced external triggers and strengthened internal resilience. Consider a story. Daniel, a software engineer, realized that social media amplified his perfectionism and anxiety. By limiting exposure to curated content and interacting intentionally with supportive communities, he regained focus, reduced comparison-based stress, and reclaimed mental energy. Psychological traps often rely on continuous input. Conscious curation disrupts the cycle, but here's the part nobody talks about. Freedom is rarely comfortable. Hannah experienced moments of doubt, resistance, and loneliness as old patterns attempted to reclaim control. Psychological traps use predictability as a safety net. Stepping out triggers both internal resistance and external pushback. Courage and persistence are essential for real transformation. Wait until you hear this. Symbolic processing and creative integration proved transformative. Hannah engaged in painting and storytelling, translating unconscious material into tangible forms. Her recurring dreams and emotional reactions found expression through art. Visualizing internal conflicts externally allowed her to interpret and integrate patterns safely, reinforcing conscious control over unconscious dynamics. Consider a story. Marcus, a man haunted by recurring anger patterns, sculpted abstract forms representing tension, restriction, and release. Observing the sculptures gave him insight into triggers he had overlooked for decades. Once visible, the patterns could be addressed consciously, reducing reactivity and reinforcing autonomy. But here's the part nobody talks about. Creative integration isn't about artistry or skill. It's about dialogue with the unconscious. The medium is secondary to the message. Engaging symbolically illuminates hidden traps and transforms latent energy into conscious insight. Wait until you hear this. Over months, Hannah noticed profound changes. Emotional reactions slowed, shadow projections decreased, boundaries felt natural, and her energy was no longer drained by habitual patterns. Psychological traps, once invisible and automatic, became identifiable and manageable. Her mind operated with clarity, focus, and intention. Consider a metaphor. Imagine walking through a house filled with hidden rooms and traps. Initially, every corner holds a surprise. Every floorboard conceals danger. Over time, as you map the rooms, identify the traps, and learn to navigate them, the house becomes familiar, no longer threatening, but fully under your control. But here's the part nobody talks about. This transformation affects relationships. Once free from unconscious traps, interactions shift dramatically. Reactions become conscious, conflicts reduce, empathy deepens, and authenticity emerges. Those who remain enmeshed in their traps often cannot tolerate this clarity, sometimes resisting the change. Awareness can be isolating temporarily, yet it is essential for growth. Wait until you hear this. Long-term integration relies on ritualization and reinforcement. Hannah structured daily routines, morning reflection, midday emotional check-ins, shadow journaling, creative expression, and evening review. Over time, these rituals reinforced conscious control, transforming temporary progress into sustained resilience. But here's the part nobody talks about. Rituals are flexible, not rigid. Missed practices do not erase progress. Consistency over time is what counts. The mind adapts, and repeated engagement gradually overrides automatic patterns. Wait until you hear this. The final insight from Hannah's journey is simple yet profound. Mastery isn't eliminating psychological traps. It's reclaiming choice. Traps will always exist in some form. Mastery is the ability to detect them, observe them, and respond intentionally. This transforms life from reactive survival to conscious authorship. So let me ask you, are you ready to observe your own mind with the same intensity? To apply reflection, shadow acknowledgement, boundaries, emotional regulation, selective exposure, symbolic processing, and rituals? Transformation requires courage, patience, and consistent action, but the reward is liberation from the hidden forces silently shaping your life.